Hey guys, in this video I want to talk about how pros utilize the slope during the leg decline phase of the pitching delivery to allow gravity to speed up their linear move towards the target. The term using the slope refers to the pitcher's usage of the slope of the mound and gravitational forces to their advantage during their linear move towards home. Let's look into this mechanical concept further by going over some good and bad examples. Alright guys, here in example number 1, we're going to take a look at Dylan Cease and how he utilizes the slope and the drive and drop to project off the mound while he loads his back leg into his hinge position. So essentially what we see here is, I have Dylan Cease essentially at peak leg lift. This is about the frame after peak leg lift. That's kind of where I begin with most looking at this mechanic. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put a dot on his front hip right here. And then we're going to progress and continue to put dots on his front hip as he progresses and continues down into bottom of leg decline. So what we're looking for bottom of leg decline is when his front foot reaches to where it's about even with his front hip. So we'll say about right there is what I would consider his bottom of leg decline. So now what I usually do is I will draw a line from the top dot to the bottom one. So we can see Cease is at about 40 degrees of angle there with his drive and drop, or how he uses the slope. So essentially why that's important is as you can see, if we just look at this motion here, while Cease is loading his back leg here, watch how he is projecting towards the target. So what we want is, and what that allows for is essentially as he's dropping, he's creating lateral energy for linear energy force towards the target. And so what he's allowing gravity to do is naturally to accelerate him as he's focused on projecting towards his target. So gravity is naturally going to pull him down as he's projecting towards his target and essentially speed up his linear move towards the target. So this is a very good example of a pro that does this really well. So we can see he's starting there, and he's gaining ground all the way as he's moving towards the target. This is a very good example of a pro that I would say uses the slope or uses the drive and drop methodology very, very well. And we can see as a result that if I draw a line from his front hip here at peak leg lift to bottom of leg decline, which is about right there, we could see that he's gained a ton of ground there. So this would be a very good example of a pro that really does a good job with this mechanic. And as he is projecting off the mound, he's dropping into his hinge and loading his hinge at a place where he is now further or closer to the target than he was at the beginning of his leg decline phase. So this would be a good example of a pro that uses the slope or uses the drive and drop methodology to speed up his linear move towards the target. Alright guys, and this next example is a player that I work with pretty closely, and this was his initial film that he sent me when we started working together. And so what we're going to do is we're kind of going to take a look here at how he uses the slope. Now that we have a good example and a good understanding of what Dylan Cease was doing, who's very good at using the slope or using the drive and drop methodology, now let's look at a case of a player where he's not really optimizing his linear move towards home and not really allowing gravity to accelerate him naturally as he projects towards the target. So what we'll do is we'll do something similar here. We're going to get Blaine kind of about a frame or two past peak leg lift as he's dropping into his back leg, and we're going to draw a dot on his front hip. So now let's take a look what kind of happens here. So as we can see, you can just kind of tell here, Blaine is not really projecting towards home. Instead, he's essentially just dropping into his back leg. So if we draw dots here, and we look kind of at his, probably take him about right there. If we take a look at his angle, he's at about 53 degrees or so. So remember, Cease was at about 40. Blaine here is at about 53. And what we can see is that as a result, you can really just see the potential energy that is lost, the linear energy that is lost as a result of Blaine just sitting straight into his back leg instead of essentially driving off while he sits into his hinge position, similar to how we saw with Dylan Cease. So now if I were to draw a line here on Blaine from where he is at the start of his leg decline to where he is at the bottom of his leg decline, see he's still gaining a little bit of ground, obviously, which is just natural, but he's gained nowhere near as much ground as Dylan Cease did. So this is an example of a guy that could really maximize his linear energy towards home if he were to project out more early on without just collapsing and loading the back leg and just dropping straight down and then projecting off the mound into the drive phase. If we can get Blaine essentially moving his body, moving his center of mass, and projecting out more early during his leg decline phase, it'll really help him allow gravity to speed up his linear move towards home and ultimately make him move quicker and move faster towards the target, which will allow him to increase his throwing velocity. So first we saw with Dylan Cease, he was at about a 40-degree angle. He's really allowing gravity to speed up his linear move. And then now we see here with Blaine, he's really just sitting down without projecting off the mound much, which is ultimately going to cause him to not speed up as much during his linear move, and he's not going to allow gravity to really allow him to project quickly off the mound towards the target. All right, guys, we're going to look at one more pro example here. Here I have Carlos Rodon, and what we're going to look at first, we'll go ahead and measure his drive and drop angle, or what we are referring to as using the slope. So we'll go ahead here, put a dot on his front hip, and we'll get him down to the end of front leg decline, just about right there. And we'll measure off this angle, which we can see somewhere around 33, 34, probably somewhere in the range of 33 to 35 degrees. So we can see here as we just kind of look at his motion that as he is dropping into that back leg, he is clearly projecting off of the mound, which allows gravity to speed up his linear move towards home. So a couple things I wanted to address is that, one, if we just draw some lines here from his front hip at essentially peak leg lift, or the frame right after peak leg lift, to where he kind of ends up at the end of leg decline, somewhere in there, you can see he's covered essentially all this ground with his center of mass or lower half, right? So he's covered quite a bit of ground there. Now, one thing I want to address is let's notice where his head position is. So one thing, and I'll talk about this in some other videos, but I felt like it was worth addressing here, is that if we kind of look at his initial linear move, so his drift there, one thing we notice is that as he's in leg lift, his shoulders, if you were to draw a line at his shoulder, where his shoulders are at the end of leg lift or peak leg lift, you would essentially see that his shoulders are pretty even there. He might even be slightly down, but definitely not tilted super far up. Now watch what happens as he goes into leg decline is you'll start to see the shoulders will get a slight tilting action. So they're starting to tilt slightly up, and that head pretty much stays back. So as we can see, the head is moving with the center of mass here into peak leg lift. But now, if I were to draw a line from where his head is here, straight down, to where it is as he gets to the end of leg decline, about right there or so, you can see there's a little bit of movement. But if we notice, the center of his head is over that back leg there. So what I'm getting at here is the center of mass, the lower half, is going to project out far off of the mound while we're essentially going through leg decline, and we want to capture that linear energy. But just consider the fact that the head is going to stay back. So there we can see that he's centered over the belly button with his head. But notice as he begins to drop, his head stays on that line all the way until about right there or so. And then if we were to look at where he's at now, his head is way behind where that belly button was. So he went from a stacked kind of position to now he's staying back over that back leg. So this is very important. We wouldn't want the pitcher to be way out here and over the belly button, because then he would be losing essentially some potential energy with that back leg. So one thing I want to address first thing here is that as the pitcher is projecting off the mound with the center of mass in the lower half, front hip, kind of how we're addressing here, that head is kind of staying back over the back leg, which will allow the pitcher to get an impulse of energy and an acceleration, where into front foot strike, we'll see that head gets kind of back centered or slightly just behind that belly button into front foot strike. So we'll talk about this in another video, but as you can see there, that he's definitely staying back with that head, definitely behind the center line there. So first thing I wanted to address there. Second thing I wanted to take a look at is the usage of the slope definitely continues past the end of leg decline. So we could say that that's about right here. Now, if I were to continue, we'll get him one more frame here. If I were to continue and draw dots here as he is in his, drive phase, we would notice that he's still continuously dropping, but it's not going to be as angled of a rate. So we can see here that he's still continuing to drop there. It's just not as steep of a rate. So what I believe is that if we can drop during leg decline and we can project off the mound and use that drive and drop where we're not just sitting straight into the glute, naturally we'll continue to project off down the slope of the mound as we get further into our drive phase before we open up into our pelvic rotational move. So two things kind of worth addressing there, I feel like. So one, we definitely want to stay back with the head, so shoulders stay level during leg lift. As we start to go into leg decline, we're projecting with the center of mass in the front hip, and meanwhile our head is kind of staying back and staying over our back leg, which will allow us to eventually kind of get some extra push and transition of energy, linear energy with that back leg as we begin to rotate. Second thing, like I just mentioned, is this drive and drop methodology continues all the way into the drive phase and into the rotational move. But essentially what I like to focus in on is during leg decline, because I feel like if the pitcher can excel at his drive and drop during leg decline, then naturally throughout the later phases of the drive phase, he'll continue to drop until he begins to rotate into front foot strike. So a couple things I felt worth addressing here. Definitely some things that I've seen with pitchers, some questions I've had come up. So hope this kind of helps you guys visualize what we need to do and what we need to fix with our mechanics if we're struggling with the drive and drop or using the slope in general. All right, guys, so a drill I really like for training the drive and drop, or essentially using the slope, where as we're projecting off, we're allowing gravity to kind of pick up our speed and project us linearly towards the target, is I'll start out wide here. And kind of what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through a normal leg lift. And what I'm going to think is with this front hip is kind of remember where that front hip started there. And that's going to be the same plane as we're coming up that we want to travel on the way down. If we kind of think that, then we're going to be essentially going at about a 40-degree angle, or in that 35 to 40-degree angle that we want to replicate on the way down. So essentially, look something like this. We'll start out wide. Remember where that front hip is, and then we're going to lift up and replicate, and then throw. So again, and I'll draw the angle so you can see as I'm coming up what angle I'm going at, and then on the way down what angle I'm going at. So again, start out wide, come up, and then throw. So that's just a simple drill you can try out. This one may not be for everybody, but I found it can definitely help players kind of learn to replicate that angle of coming up and coming back down, as opposed to coming up, sitting, and then projecting out. If you can kind of replicate that angle that you're having on the way up from this position, down, back down, oftentimes you're gonna move at that gradual drive and drop angle that we're looking for, where we're using the slope.